The time is at hand.
From the crackhead capital of the world, in Williamson, West Virginia, you're in Dark Places. My name is Junebug Fugit. I'm your Huckleberry. I took my son, Brandon, to a drone show on Saturday, May 17th. It's cool what those drones can do. Pretty freaky, making all these little pictures and stuff in the sky. I just wonder what people thought as they drove by out on the highway. I need to look on MUFON's website and see if there was a bunch of people reporting UFOs over Pineville, Kentucky on May 17th. Be pretty funny. And also here in West Virginia, there's a locust invasion of biblical proportions. Check us out. You hear that noise? It kind of sounds like a siren. That's just millions of locusts just sitting there waiting for the right time. I say, let's get this show on the road. I don't like it here anymore. And speaking of show, this week on the show, we have Vampires, Part 2. And go back and check out Part 1, way back on episode 51. It's been a while. And here with a vampire story of his very own is my good buddy, Jimmy Haunted.
For a while, so give them blood, gallons of the stuff. Give them all that they can drink, and it will never be enough.
This is your old pal, Mr. Haunted, talking about the vampire Mercy Brown, when Rhode Island was the vampire capital of the world. In 1892, the oddly well-preserved, exhumed body of Mercy Brown led many to believe she was a vampire responsible for the death of members of her family in Exeter, Rhode Island. The story of accused vampire Mercy Brown and Rhode Island's brief tenure as the vampire capital of America was first published as The Words on Nellie's Tombstone in Yankee Magazine, January 1994. The villagers of Exeter, Rhode Island knew that Farmer George Brown had a problem. First, in 1883, his wife, Mary Brown, succumbed to a mysterious illness. 6 months later, his 20-year-old daughter, Mary Brown, also fell ill and died. Within the next several years, his 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Brown, also died, and George's teenage son, Edwin Brown, a healthy lad who worked as a store clerk, suddenly became frail and sick. The village doctor informed George that consumption was taking his family, but the country folk of Exeter had another explanation. On a chilly March afternoon in 1892, a group of men entered Exeter's Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Then they began to exhume the bodies of George Brown's wife and 2 daughters. They had concluded that one of the deceased was leaving the grave at night to suck the life out of its relatives. Only by killing the vampire could young Edwin be saved. First, the men examined the bodies of Mrs. Brown and daughter Mary. Finding them to be properly decomposed, they began to exhume Mercy Brown. Slowly, they shoveled into Mercy's grave. When they reached the corpse, they suddenly stepped back in terror. Terror, I say! Mercy, who had been buried for more than 2 months, appeared oddly well preserved. It seemed that her hair and nails had grown, and when the men cautiously prodded the corpse with their shovel, they found that it was still filled with fresh blood. The suspected vampire's heart was removed and burned on a nearby rock. The ashes were added to young Edwin's medicine. Still, The boy died less than 2 months later. Their little antidote didn't work. And to the less superstitious, there was perhaps nothing so unusual about the well-preserved condition of Mercy's body. She had been in the ground during the 2 coldest months of the year. The mysterious wave of illnesses that swept George Brown's family was probably tuberculosis. But that did not keep Rhode Island from becoming known as the vampire capital of America. South County, whose isolated villages resembled the lonely hamlets of Transylvania, was a hotbed of vampire rumors between 1870 and 1900. When Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula in 1897, died, newspaper accounts of vampire Mercy Brown were found in his files. The legends persist to this day. In Rhode Island Historical Cemetery No. 2 stands the gravestone of alleged vampire Nellie Vaughan of West Greenwich, who died in 1889 at the age of 19. The grave is supposedly cursed. One local university professor who studied vampirism claimed that no vegetation or lichen would grow on Nellie's grave despite numerous attempts to plant there. And people are still taken aback by the inscription along the bottom of Nellie's tombstone. The curious words read, "I am watching and waiting for you." And this is your roving news correspondent, Mr. Haunted. Back to more In Dark Places.
They can fix me proper with a bit of luck. The doctors and the nurses, they adore me so, but it's really quite alarming, 'cause I'm such an awful fuck. I gave you blood, gallons of the stuff. I gave you all that you could.
Thank you, Jimmy. That's crazy. Fear of the undead. Are all vampire stories the stuff of nightmares or horror films? Daniel Farson provides plentiful evidence to prove that the fear of vampires, at least, is as real today as it ever has been. Belief in vampires seems at first to be the most far-fetched of superstitions. Ghosts and even werewolves seem relatively rational compared to the idea that corpses creep from their coffins at night to suck the blood of the living. Yet, legends of vampirism have persisted since the beginning of time and still hold sway today. The problem that surrounds the legends and belief in vampires is sorting out the fantasy, and to some people, that is all there is, from the truth. A rational person might be forgiven for viewing the search for real vampires with more than a little skepticism, for how can there be such creatures? Are they not just figments of the imagination? Yet there exist reports from Eastern Europe that in the 18th century, vampirism had reached almost epidemic proportions. The documentation is so detailed, and the witnesses included reputable people such as clergymen and doctors, that it seems impossible that every man was mistaken. But again, the skeptic might point out that 18th century clergymen might have been telling the truth as they saw it, but the truth had become hopelessly confused with fear, superstition, and ignorance. And before we dismiss vampirism as a relic of the Dark Ages, perhaps we should consider the modern controversy over what constitutes the state of death. If, with the most technologically advanced equipment at our disposal, we still cannot agree on the precise moment of death, then perhaps we should not overlook those vampire reports of 200 years ago. There must be some underlying truth in them, but what? According to the records of Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania, which was then divided into 3 separate states of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania, were particularly infested with vampirism in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It was a huge problem that involved hundreds of eyewitnesses from all classes of life. One surgeon called in to investigate a series of cases wrote, "Vampirism spread like a pestilence through Slavia and Wallachia, causing numerous deaths and disturbing all the land with fear of the mysterious visitors against which no one felt himself secure." Most of the cases reported from these areas at that time showed common features. One classic amount concerns a departure that set out from Belgrade in 1732 to investigate the alleged vampire who was said to be systematically attacking a family in a remote village. When the investigating officers arrived, including some men of impeccable standing, such as the public prosecutor, they were told that a villager who had died 3 years earlier had come back as a vampire to terrorize his own family. He had already killed 3 nieces and 1 nephew by draining them of their lifeblood, and would have killed his 5th victim, another beautiful niece, had he not been interrupted and forced to flee into the night. The deputation of officials and what was left of the terrified family dully gathered round the vampire's grave as darkness fell. When they opened the coffin, they found, to all outward appearances, a sleeping, or perhaps unconscious, man. He should have been decomposed long ago. Instead, he looked as healthy as any of those standing around his grave. His hair and nails were long, his eyes half open, and his heart was still beating. Tradition was upheld. The heart of the undead was pierced through with a stout iron stake. A horrible mixture of white fluid and what looked like fresh blood gushed out. But the task had to be finished. They cut off his head with an axe and buried the grisly remains in quicklime. Another vampire story from that place and time described how a young Hungarian soldier billeted on a farm was greatly disturbed by the reaction of the family he was staying with during supper one evening. An old man came in from the dark and sat down to the meal with him. When he touched the farmer on the shoulder, the family seemed out of their wits with fear. The next day they told the soldier why. During the night the farmer had died, claimed, they said, by the man who had so lightly touched him, his father who had been dead for 10 years. This was no mere ghost, the bereaved family insisted, but a vampire. Impressed by what he had seen and heard, the soldier told it to his regimental officer, who ordered the old man's grave to be opened up. The previous night's unwelcome visitor lay there like a man newly dead, but his veins contained blood like a living man. His head was cut off and his body laid to rest, this time for good. Although the cure for vampirism differed slightly from area to area, it was always drastic and never to be undertaken by the squeamish. The favorite technique was to plunge a wooden iron stake through the alleged vampire's heart, a method also used in Britain to stop the ghosts of suicides wandering at night. Not surprisingly, the staked vampire frequently gave off a disgusting stench that one report described a corpse that was puffed up and bloated like a great leech, ready to burst. The normal processes of decomposition, with which most modern readers are familiar, would account for both foul odor and grotesque swelling, although superstitious peasants, terrified beyond reason, might not stop to consider this fact before dealing summarily with the vampire. Again, another report stated that a quantity of fresh scarlet blood issued, and from the nose and mouth, as well as from that part of his body which decency forbids me to name. Yet those who are acquainted with the physical effects of death, nurses, morticians, and executioners among them, know full well that such discharges are not uncommon when the muscles relax after death, either before rigor mortis sets in or when it finally passes off. With very few exceptions, corpses rot, but not all rotting corpses are vampires. There are, however, curious details that seem to mark some so-called vampire stories as abnormal and worth investigating. One of the undead was said to weep and scream with anguish when the stake was hammered into him. This would have been remarkable indeed had the man been dead beyond doubt when staked, but not quite so unusual if he had been prematurely buried alive, but apparently dead, perhaps due to catalepsy. And it does look as if some of these stories have exaggerated the length of time the vampire had been dead and buried, as we shall see.
Rock anthem is something that really inspires real honest.
Just driving along in a Chevy. It's something you'd like pump your fist to. It's just rock.
Turn it up.
Introducing Entertainment Weekly's new Rock Anthem CD collection. This exclusive new collection has 24 timeless rock anthems, compiled for the first time on 2 amazing CDs or audio cassettes. And when you order Entertainment Weekly, you get the Rock Anthems collection free.
For free?
I don't believe it.
It's free when you subscribe to Entertainment Weekly at a savings of almost 70% off the cover price. Call right now and get 30 issues for 4 monthly installments of only $5.99 each, or use your credit card today.
This is definitely the ultimate air guitar collection.
So call and subscribe today. You'll save almost 70% off Entertainment Weekly, and you'll get the new Rock Anthems collection free.
2 CDs of those old songs would be like bringing back the old friends.
In 1746, the French monk Dom Calment, one of the earliest authorities on vampirism, struggled to keep an open mind while searching for the truth. And the truth was not always easy to discern under a welter of superstition and confused eyewitness accounts. But he felt forced to admit, we are told that dead men return from their tombs, are heard to speak, walk about, injure both men and animals, whose blood they drain, making them sick and finally causing their death. Nor can the men deliver themselves unless they dig the corpses up and drive a sharp stake through these bodies, cut off their heads, tear out their hearts, or else burn the bodies to ashes. It seems impossible not to subscribe to the prevailing belief that these apparitions do actually come forth from their graves. It is not, however, a statement that would stand up to cross-examination. And it is interesting to note the telling phrases, we are told, and it seems possible not to subscribe to the prevailing belief. Dom Calment's was not an eyewitness account, and his susceptibility to the prevailing belief of the day could have made him a witch hunter, flat earther, or Nazi with no intellectual struggle at all. However, the great French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau went much further, stating boldly, if ever there was in the world a warranted and proven history, it is of vampires. Nothing is lacking. Official reports, testimonials of persons of standing, of surgeons, of clergymen, of judges. The judicial evidence is all-embracing. With all due respect to a great man, Rousseau displays greater faith in persons of standing than he does in vampires. And it is not quite true, in his statement at least, that nothing is lacking. Documents apparently abound, but Rousseau could not lay his hands quite so easily on actual vampires. Montague Summers, a clergyman and writer on the occult, on this matter at least, erred on the side of skepticism, claiming that in Romania they found gathered together around the vampire almost all the beliefs and superstitions that prevail throughout the whole of Eastern Europe. But even in the 21st century, there are people who believe in vampires as real, supernatural beings. The Reverend Neil Smith, a well-known exorcist of Hampstead in London, believes that vampires exist even in the populous capital. They are, he says, half animal and half human, and totally evil. He dismisses the idea that vampire attacks are all in mankind of the alleged victim by citing what constitutes him incontrovertible evidence of their existence. He claims to have dealt personally with several cases of vampirism. One victim showed the marks on her wrists, which appeared at night, where the blood was taken, almost like by an animal scratching. He denied vehemently that these marks could have been self-inflicted. He gave a further example of a man from South America who had a similar phenomenon, as if an animal had sucked away his blood and attacked him. And of course, not only vampires attack human beings. Judging from the increasing evidence, so do poltergeists, humanoids, and other allied phenomena, Perhaps vampires are real in the sense that they are from another time and place, another dimension. Part flesh, part materialization. We know so little about the paranormal that literally anything might be possible. Yet a few salient facts about the vampire's bloodlust may make matters clearer. From time immemorial, the ritual drinking of blood has been the vital element in sacrifice, gaining power and propagating the gods. For life, one must have blood, and the primitive mind equated more blood with more vitality. Aztecs poured human blood into the mouths of their idols to appease them, while Indian Rajas drank blood from severed heads in order to gain greater strength. The ancient Chinese ate the brains of the revered dead in order to gain wisdom, at the same time guarding the corpse before burial to prevent a dog or cat jumping over it, which would, they believed, turn the dead person into a vampire.
Ancient Chinese secret, huh?
The Romans, brutalized though most of them were horrified by tales of what Christians did as part of their worship. They ate flesh and drank blood. Indeed, it seems likely that a tiny minority of the early Christians, misunderstanding the symbolic nature of the communion bread and wine, may have resorted to cannibalism. But blood drinking, disgusting though it may seem to us, is very different from supernatural vampirism, and this all seems light years away from the enlightened world of the 21st century. Yet in 1973, and in as unlikely a setting as anyone could imagine, the fundamental fear of the vampire actually killed a man. In Stockholm-Trent, Paul Chadwick's stomping grounds. We miss you, Paul. In the heart of Britain's potteries, a town once bustling with the thriving businesses and scandals of the Novak's riches, but now distinguished only by a faded grandeur and sense of waste. Consequently, the row of gloomy Gothic-style houses known as the villas does not seem out of place in this defeated landscape, but what happened at number 3 does not seem to have been a very natural occurrence at all. Demetrius Mercura died there in bizarre and grisly circumstances. Nothing much was known about the dead man, except that he was a Polish immigrant who had come to work in the potteries 25 years earlier. When he did not turn up for work, and no one saw him for a few days, the neighbors called the police. John Pry, a young and keen policeman, investigated. It seemed that Mercura had been frightened of electricity, for all the light bulbs had been removed from his room. Using his flashlight, John Pye examined the room. There were newspapers scattered all over the floor, and using a frying pan under the bed, on which the dead man had lay half covered by a pile of old clothes and tattered blankets, fully dressed, with one hand behind his head and the other lying across his waist. He might have been sleeping, except for the fact that his mouth was wide open, as if in stark terror. The pathologist's report said the man had choked to death on a pickled onion. Besides single, slightly eccentric people are commonly found dead by neighbors and police in scenes of squalor. The incident might have passed into obscurity had not John Pye been puzzling over one or two details of that chaotic room. Details not worth mentioning at the time, because they seem to have no bearing on the unfortunate man's death. For a start, the room had been scattered liberally with salt. A bag of it had been placed between Mercura's legs, and there was another resting behind his head. There was also salt mixed with urine in various containers placed around the room, and an upturned bowl in the window ledge concealed a mixture of excreta and garlic. The curious and unpleasant details seemed to remind P.C. Pye of something he had heard or read somewhere. And then he remembered what it might all mean. He went to the library and consulted Anthony Masters' The Natural History of the Vampire from 1972. His suspicions were confirmed. The salt, the urine, the garlic were all features of an old age ritual to protect oneself against vampires. The coroner was persuaded to examine the pickled onion It was, as John Pye had gathered, a clove of garlic. What agony and terror Makira must have suffered in that room on his own, so afraid of vampires that he actually tried to sleep with a clove of garlic in his mouth. And it was on this protective device that he choked to death. Obsessions, especially among the lonely, take many forms, and this man was obviously obsessed with vampires. He came from Eastern Europe, where fear of the undead is still quite common. He lived on his own. Perhaps he was simply unhinged. But although no one will ever know whether the loathsome creatures were hallucinations, projections from his mind, or a sick fancy, his fear of them was real. So it could be said that the vampires did get him in the end. We are woefully out of time. I hope you enjoyed those vampire stories. Believe it or not, there's still lots more to go. So there will be a part 3. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate you. And a big thank you to Mr. Jimmy Haunted. We'll see you again right here next week. God bless.